You are listening to an After Dinner Conversation Magazine podcast. After Dinner Conversation believes humanity is improved by ethics and morals grounded in philosophical truth, and that truth is discovered through intentional reflection and respectful debate. In order to facilitate this process, we have created a growing series of print books, a monthly short story magazine, and 2 different podcasts. This podcast, Philosophy Ethics Short Story Audiobooks, provides audiobook recordings of the stories that have appeared in our magazine, and our companion podcast, Philosophy Ethics Short Story Discussions, is where we discuss the ethics of the choices made in the stories as a way to model the kinds of discussions we hope you're having with these readings with friends, family, and students. We would love it if you went over to check it out. I'm Roberta, your narrator and story editor at After Dinner Conversation Publishing. Thank you for spending your time listening to our podcast and for reading the magazine. Thank you for supporting us through your magazine subscriptions and through patreon.com/afterdinnerconversation. And of course, if you enjoy this audiobook reading, please subscribe to our podcast, share it on social media, and suggest it to friends. Today's story is A Change of Verbs, written by Tom Teti and published in our May 2021 magazine. A Change of Verbs by Tom Teti. A change of verbs can be a boon to a man's life. Such was the thought that seized Simon McCalla in mid-bite of his double-toasted English muffin. It was Friday, precisely 7:52 a.m. by the clock on the range. I said, "What time is it?" yelled his wife from the closet. She rummaged for something. "Are you there? What in creation are you doing?" "Sorry," he said. 7:52. 3. I can't hear you." Her bark was muffled by the winter coats. She appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, pulling up her pantyhose and pulling down a slip under her skirt. Her legs were still sturdy. "What good does it do me to ask the time if I have to come in here to hear you?" 7:53. 4. "Yes, I see that now. I have a meeting at the hospital with the chief of surgery. He's an idiot, but a punctual one." She shook her head, inhaled through her nose, and went back for a jacket. "What's the temperature?" Simon, back to his English muffin, twisted in his chewing to get a read on the thermometer mounted on the side of the shady window. 62, he replied, and added his traditional caveat, "But this thermometer is unreliable. It's outside, you know, and in the shade." "Did you hear the weather?" his wife demanded to know from deep within the same rack of coats. "Sorry," he chewed. "Do you want the radio on? Carol?" She muttered along in such a way that he could not quite be certain whether she had heard him or not. "I'm cold now. I just don't know if it will be that way. Oh, I'll just wear this." She emerged from the closet with a short camel-hair jacket. She bustled into the kitchen, dropped it onto the stool in front of which sat her rapidly chilling toaster waffles, and went to the powder room, putting on dangling pearl earrings, which he knew had been in her hand since she left the bedroom. "Would it be too much to wait for me to eat one of these mornings?" "You," he paused. "I can never tell if you're actually wanting to eat or not," he said, thinking of her ritual 2 bites at the counter, standing up and tossing the rest of the cold waffle into the sink and down the disposal. Of course she never heard anything he said unless he got up and went to the doorway, because the powder room light was connected to a very noisy exhaust fan. He stayed on his stool and finished his muffin. It was 7:58. At 7:59 exactly, 1 minute before he had to leave the house, she would ask the daily question. Simon pondered his answer more intently than usual. He watched the powder room. Carol's shoulder and elbow could be seen, as well as her handsome 40-something derriere in that straight black skirt, the backs of her ankles in gray tights, and the stacked heels of her shoes, but not her face. He gulped the rest of his coffee, the dispiriting decaf she insisted they switched to oh so many months ago, and rose to face his fate. On schedule it came. "What are your plans for today?" Simon pushed his rimless glasses up his nose. He stalled for time. "Well, I teach the seminar this morning." "Yes," she called. "And I have a class at 1, and a meeting for the college newspaper at 2:30. Darling, I know that you have a job. That's not what I'm asking. We go through this every day." They were his usual answers, and she anticipated them. They could be heard without turning off the fan in the powder room. "I'm asking what you're doing after that." She prattled on about the dog and taking him around to have Dr. Burks look at his coat and confirm that the supplements he dispensed were working, as they seemed to be. Simon gazed out the kitchen sliding doors at the dog tethered to a come-along. He sat in a restless posture, panting with his tongue hanging out of his mouth and looking into the kitchen as if he knew he was the subject of some 11th-hour decision. "Chiku must be evaluated before we continue with more vitamins," Carol said. "You need to take him." It was not a drastic situation. It wasn't even a problem situation. The dog clearly was fine. The challenge would then become, could he, Simon, finish his sentence before being sentenced himself? The day ahead passed through his mind as he would like it to happen. A stimulating seminar with piquant seniors on the landscape of the body in 19th century literature, a cup of Sumatra off to the side, Stilton and walnuts on spring mix at the Hound and Duck while reading The Luck of Roaring Camp, class with hopeful juniors on America's solitary Western voices, a meeting with the newspaper where he would deftly quell a movement on the part of some of the female writers to cease promoting sports, afternoon half-calf from Perfumes of Arabica, a sit on the slab bench under the tulip poplar at the pond, musing about the qualitative effect of one's first sight on something beautiful. Then, after scribbling the opening of a sonnet on the back of an envelope, he would go home. When the sun had a few minutes left, he and Carol would walk the dog, prepare branzino with a butternut squash risotto, and open a bottle of Chardonnay, probably Australian, with fire in the fireplace and a movie, perhaps. It was an old picture, meaning a picture of oldness, settled and 2 steps from a yawn. Perhaps, but one that pleased him, made him feel warm, content, loving, and loved. He wished for it, but pictured it as he feared it would unfold. Seniors having Sumatra decaf for him and checking their cell phones to see how much longer until class was over. Failing to say that he had other plans when one of the faculty asked him to have lunch and discuss curriculum. Juniors cutting because it was Friday and they could get drunk before dark. A bellicose argument between 2 sides of the newspaper staff, and Simon hearing himself say that their concerns may be valid and should be addressed at student government, rushing home to take Chiku to the vet so the vet could say he looks great, then rushing back to prepare dinner, not the branzino because there wasn't time, but defrosted shrimp from the freezer, sautéed in some kind of quasi-scampi over linguine. Carol calling to say she'd be late, then crashing in exhausted, full of questions and directives, telling him the fire's too hot on a night like this, and she doesn't want any wine because she's got a headache. Then a movie, but she'd fall asleep at the 31-minute mark, her head crooked in the corner of the sofa, the dog asleep at her feet. The moment had come. Simon took his tweedy jacket with the suede elbows from the hook by the back door, glanced toward the dog, who was eyeing the door with martial arts kind of calm, ready to break the spell at the drop of a leash, and marched to the powder room. As his wife returned her makeup to its pouch and turned off the light and fan, Simon heard himself say, in the deafening quiet, "I'm busy this afternoon. I'm going to walk by the pond and work on my sonnet." Then he gave her the expected peck in the cheek, turned and walked to the back door. His last vision of her was a modestly stunned gape as he pulled his cheek away from hers, keeping his senses alert for any protest on his exit. He tried, as best as he could, to walk in a way he considered normal and hoped it appeared the same to Carol, though internally he was like a geyser about to spray. With his hand on the knob, he heard her say, "What about dinner?" "I'll be back," he said, perfectly in stride through the door and shutting it behind him. The air felt brisk and lively. The sun glinted off his glasses, but today it didn't annoy him. He craved it. He slipped into his jacket and clipped down the flagstone to the brick-lined sidewalk on his way to the college. This was the way a professor was supposed to feel as he began his day, hale, hearty, of sinewy mind and assured effect, headed for a day of scholastic and the acrobatic engagement of ideas. He waved to a man across the street. "Hello," he called. The man looked back curiously, held up a finger of acknowledgement, and frowned. Simon smiled. "Surprised him," he chuckled. In 10 minutes he was entering the old double-window doors of Perfumes of Arabica. A very thin student, a girl with piercings in her eyelids and nose and dyed hair of an unnameable color, was scooping beans from a plastic-lined burlap bag that had Kenya stamped on it. She cheerily asked him if he wanted a small decaf to go. "Do not waver, do not deliberate, not today," thought Simon, as he imagined himself saying what he usually said. "That Sumatra smells good, but I suppose I shouldn't. I guess I'll have the decaf." Instead, he told her, "I want Sumatra today." Her eyebrows went up, rings and all. "Ooh, Friday, the good stuff, huh?" Simon did not blush. "Yep," he sang, and felt taller. He doctored his cup with raw sugar, taboo, and cream, strode across the wooden floor to the old doors, bade the young thing goodbye, and then stepped into the commerce of a campus morning. He sipped the bold, sweet, earthy stuff and made for Forbes Hall, his chest a-swell with pleasure in himself. The seminar began with a chuckle as Simon pointed out the one student who had arrived without a cup of Sumatra from Perfumes of Arabica. "How do you expect to keep up, Nicolette, with such antisocial obstinacy?" The entire group laughed at the first thing their professor had ever said that they recognized as meant to be funny, and was. From then on, the interchange fairly hopped from mouth to mouth, and after 2 hours, the group wrapped up, seeming to pine for more. Simon headed for the Hound and Duck. At the base of the steps, he heard his name called out. It was Carl Fromuth, the department chairman. Professor McCullough, he always called him. Carl attempted to foster a practice of tongue-in-cheek formalism. "I am anxious to arrive at some consensus about our plans for a media room, scheduling, security responsibilities, etc. I know we have a meeting for Tuesday, but I have invited Dr. Gupta, and I think lunch today would give us a head start." 12 in the faculty dining room? Yesterday and all the days before, Simon would have said, "I guess that would be all right," or "I was trying to, I'll switch something around and be there." "If you don't have any other plans," said Fromuth, quite insincerely, and beginning to reascend the library steps. "I do, actually," Simon said, watching the chairman's startled reaction with quiet excitement. "I have plans at lunch." "Ah, well, Tuesday it will have to be then." "Good," Simon proceeded in the opposite direction, pushing his rimless glasses back on his nose. During a mental speculation on the self-serving interchangeability of the verbs want, need, must, and have to, he allowed himself an annoyance at the glasses he continually had to reposition on his face, because they threatened to fall from it. He stopped to look at himself in the corner window of a classroom in the Science Center. "I hate these glasses," he said to himself, marveling at how one could simplify one's day by resisting equivocation. He did not say, "These are perfectly presentable glasses, though they do nothing for me and they slip all the time. But they are scholarly, if a little old-looking." He didn't do that. He went to the heart of the matter. He hated them. Simon passed the optician on the way to the Hound and Duck. He hurried in and removed his now openly reviled pair. "I am picking out new frames and must have them by," he checked his watch, 10 to 1. "Can you do it?" The clerk was the owner of the store who had fit him for his original glasses. "Not happy with these?" he asked, taking them between his fingers. "Let's slip them on and see what the problem is. Perhaps we can make an adjustment." Simon passed by the niceties that burdened his conscience, the not wanting to insult the owner by criticizing the product, the possibility that he might be offended by the assertion that he had not fit a customer well, and that he had recommended a set of frames based on a stereotype of an English professor. Simon passed by those niceties by selecting a verb that told the man exactly what he wished the man to do. "No," he said, moving his head to make it impossible to get the glasses back on his face. "I want a new pair." "Ah, you don't want these," said the man. With a frayed knot about to slip through his lips, Simon astonished himself. "I do not." He went to the case displaying frames by a natty Italian designer. "There they are," he said, pointing to a pair of light tortoiseshell plastic ones with smallish round eyes. The optician spoke haltingly. "I recall that, you and your wife decided against those last time." "Yes," said Simon, without actually trying them. "I will try them today." The man took them from the case and fit them on Simon. "Small. Might take some getting used to, but very becoming with your coloring, actually," he said with a bit of surprise. Simon checked himself in the mirror. His face was new, his eyes bemused, holding something unsaid, instead of naked, exposed, and defenseless, as he looked with the other ones. His mouth was now a confident, drawn line, not a constantly waffling amoeba. He watched his mouth say, 2 hours? "Yes, sir. I'll be back at 1:45. The man attempted to hand Simon his former glasses. "They slip off my nose," he said, as he exited the shop and made for the campus bookstore. He bought a pair of reading magnifiers, the extra thin, extra light kind that one can look over while reading, and arrived at the Hound and Duck precisely at 11:45. He took a table by the window, ordered the salad with the Stilton, and began to read, feeling such a pleasure in his relaxed control of things that it paradoxically made him quite hyperactive. He fiddled with his fork, his spoon, his napkin, swiveled in his seat, checked his page numbers, and observed those who walked by his window. There was happiness in this fidgety state, he realized. There was anticipation of the class he was about to teach, of the walk he was going to take, of his poetry, of his lunch, even what waited for him on the next page of The Luck of Roaring Camp, even of the prospect that someone would walk past the window and want to corral him, join him. This was life as it should be, he thought. Good or bad, exciting or boring, inspiring or disappointing, there must always be something in the balance, a mountain to climb, a fresh view on the other side. That is what drew him to Western literature, the presence of the mountain. The view might only be another mountain, but scaling that mountain was the next chance of something special. His reverie, while staring at the blue sky, was interrupted by the arrival of his salad and 2 slices of a rough-looking bread. He slathered Stilton on one side, envisioning Carol sitting across from him, bringing a forkful of quiche to her mouth, staring at what he was doing, just staring at the slice of bread and the cheese and the knife until he became self-conscious and stopped. "That's too much, you know." "Well, not today. Today it was perfect." Simon found something unexpectedly invigorating in the story, a juxtaposition of mid-19th century literacy and roughing it in early California, a purpose for the people, yet an absence of fussiness. There was a tap on the window. "I have a meeting soon, but will you still be here at 1? Dr. Gupta mouthed the words more than he spoke them. She always wore traditional Indian dress, and to Simon her tiny 70-year-old frame always seemed lost in her garments, as if, upon closest inspection, there might not be anybody in there at all. She was the department's renowned guest professor, operating on a huge grant from several sources. A much-published, highly sought-after scholar of poetry who seemed to like Simon, for some reason he could not actually pinpoint. He felt the first pincers of difficulty from his new approach to life. He did not want to offend her. "Sorry, no. Class at 1. Dr. Gupta looked disappointed. She checked her wristwatch, then shrugged and smiled. "Another time," she said, and moved on down the avenue. It was Simon's turn to look disappointed. The truth worked, a postulate in which he had never had any faith. Dr. Gupta went on her way because 15 minutes was not her idea of enough. So what bothered him? Perhaps, he thought with an inner alarm, perhaps that he had not actually wanted her to go. He did not have to go in 15 minutes if he waited until after class to pick up his glasses. But he wanted his new glasses, and he wanted to talk with Dr. Gupta about poetry. He could have invited her to join him, then suggested they walk to the optician's together. That's what others always did to him, used to do to him, yesterday and before. They got him to spend his time as they wished. Simon read. He ate. He loved. The fork was becoming a problem. He took a wide slab of baguette from the breadbasket and opened it from the side. It was just wide enough for him to make a modest sandwich. He stuffed spring mix and the lovely ochre and slate-colored Stilton and walnuts and the vinaigrette, all of it, into the bread and chomped ungraciously but happily on it while he turned pages. Then, with no wife there to scowl, no colleague to inhibit, he did it again. The sandwiches were an unexpected find. So was the story. He inhaled them both with new lungs. Simon exited the Hound and Duck and clipped across to the optician's. His first look at himself was enormously satisfying. He bounced out of the shop with a flair and a new face and strode erect and anticipative to Forbes. The juniors were buzzing with talk of Friday night plans and would not quiet down. Simon sat and watched them with a smirk. Under the hubbub, Stephanie Cummer, ever in a front seat, said, "I like your glasses." "Thank you," said Simon, pleased. "Are they new?" "Yes, you're the first one to see them." "Really?" Simon looked at her. Young and 20, frizzy locks and scrubbed carelessness, dark, ingenious, and willing to believe him. The equivocating responses he normally would have used occurred to him. Things like, "Well, other people saw me come over here, and some even looked at me, but no one has actually said anything until you. I didn't mean to mislead you." Instead, he said, "Of course not. I'm teasing you." And he laughed out loud. While Stephanie adjusted with surprise and a particle of delighted offense, the rest of the class focused on their instructor who had just expressed voluble mirth in their presence. Simon seized the moment. "What does the title, The Luck of Roaring Camp, signify for you?" They stared at him from one of those vacuous states that often went on for too long. Simon nipped it in the bud. "Stephanie." Stephanie began a speculation on the word luck. There must be luck coming in the story. Or, said another young woman, it could be irony. Two of the male students picked up the word roaring and spoke to the evocation of a place and population that promised to be very lively and energetic. Several women added that it might be more literal, speaking of a setting simply bellicose from its abundance of testosterone. All of the women then chimed in that the word camp suggested a male word, to which all the men countered that the first character officially mentioned was a woman. The women said she wasn't a woman, she was a prostitute, and so it went. It was a buoyant discussion for any class, let alone Fridays. It ended too quickly, the students filing out with an unspoken ruefulness at its conclusion. Almost all of them told Simon to enjoy his weekend, and the young women complimented him on his glasses. The new staff rebels were already gathered and in tedious debate when he arrived. Simon had been thinking ahead. He called for quiet. "Do either of you have an agenda?" he asked. The young women and young men looked at each other. A moment of puzzlement was obliterated by 7 voices squawking at once. "Well," announced Simon conclusively, "it's far too nice an afternoon to spend indoors arguing about what we will argue about. Get your agenda straight, and I will see you Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. Have a safe weekend." Simon ever so privately enjoyed this stunned silence and their eyes that followed as he exited first. Simon made a beeline for perfumes of Arabica. A different ex-student was in charge and overwhelmed, ripping the top off a burlap bag, Costa Rica stenciled on the side. "Hi," she trilled, "decaf?" Instead of waiting politely for her to finish what she was doing, Simon simply said, "I'll have medium half French roast, half mocha Java decaf to go." He took his cup, fixed with more raw sugar this time, and cream, and sipped it walking. A pleasant breeze with a slight challenge in it crossed his face, mussing his hair, and he let it. The path to the pond had shade from a bower of oaks in the afternoon, and it made things harder to discern until one returned to the sunshine. When he did, he saw all the benches which lined the edge of the pond were taken, except one. He went to it, sat, took out a pencil and departmental memo of the day, and started to put words on the back of it. He heard a voice from the nagging bin, a voice that always waylaid him when he was attempting to move from the analytical to the creative. What are you doing? They're just words. You need a better plan. Simon remembered the other times he heard that voice and the defeated, dolorous way he would sit, acknowledging his lack of procedure. And there would be no poem. There would be nothing. I know, he said, perhaps aloud. I am starting with words. Words I like. Ah, that is interesting, said a voice. This one was real. Simon turned. Standing above his shoulder was Dr. Gupta. He was so pleased to see her. I knew a gifted man who worked in that way also. She nodded at him approvingly. He did not say, well, it's sort of a first time for me. He said instead, I am hoping it will lead to an interesting place. And he marveled that both statements were true, yet they told contrasting stories. I have not seen you here before. I plan to come more often than I do, he answered. Oh, you must do better. I come here all the time. It's a favorite practice of mine. It would be good for you. It appeared that I would not get a seat. Then I saw you and decided to ask if I could join you. Delighted. Not by all means. Not, oh, if you think you need to be alone, it's actually time for me to go. Not, oh, certainly. Just shove my bag onto the ground. Just delighted. The doctor settled in next to him. There. I look forward to this place so very much. In India, one does not find such places often. A small body of water where only birds bathe, surrounded by drooping trees and tall grasses, shaded and sunlit all the same. Where I come from, we have either not enough water or too much of it. Ah, she sang as she sat and looked at the water. Simon felt his first discomfort of the day. He held a pencil between his fingers and a piece of scrap on his briefcase, ready to channel the muses and rearrange his words. He was also ready for a rare dialogue on verse. But the visiting poetry scholar sitting beside him only stared at the wilderness scene before them. It was unnerving. Should he work and peacefully ignore her? Should he talk and disturb her quiet? One step further, he thought. That's what I must do, go one step further. What's the verb for this? Engage. That's the one. Do you think in words or images? He asked. She did not change her gaze, but smiled. What a very good question, and interesting. At this moment, I'm thinking in images. But how far can we ever be from a word? One might even say that images are made up of words. Simon chose his next verb challenge. We do have images before we learn words, however. Dr. Gupta smiled again. True, but once we do learn words, our images either expand or become limited by them. The task is to then expand them because we have the means to magnify them with words. Now Simon smiled. He glanced at the words he had already written. Beauty, air, spirit, and name, fingers, water. They were scattered in a random cluster at the top third of the page. To those he added, waiting, surging, flew, and smiled again. Dr. Gupta saw him, he knew, though she looked only at the surface of the pond in her benign fashion. You must come here again. Do not let yourself divide into several beings. Keep the teacher and the poet and the man all one. When she excused herself to use the library, he stayed until the light turned dusky, and he began a deliberate and thoughtful walk home. Yet before he reached his street, he took a detour and walked purposefully to the quad. He had no idea how to continue. Here I am, he said to himself, standing in the middle of the campus with no intention, no plan. He watched a girl slog across the lawn with her backpack overloaded, then 3 boys with no books doing a raucous slapstick meandering to nowhere in particular. Am I like them? He asked himself. He knew only one thing. He found a payphone in the lobby of Covey Memorial Hall and dialed his house. He had never wanted a cell phone. Now he wished he had one. Carol was not home, yet. His too long announcement played through to the end. Hello, it's me. It's 5:55. I'm not there, as you can probably tell. I'm not coming home. He hung up. Simon felt instantly that he had been mean and that what he had done was wrong. To hang up and not say what he meant, not clarify whether he would be home in 2 hours, or not until bedtime, or not at all. He knew it was an act of hostility, possibly an act of cruelty inflicted on Carol, his wife of 13 years, but directed at everyone. Yet he knew also that he did not want to go home. He didn't know what else to say about it, except that he wanted to never be beholden again to the routine others expected of him, if he could help it. He wandered the lanes surrounding the college, past the athletic fields, and then the student houses and the neighborhoods in which they roomed and carried out their blithe lives. He came upon J&D's corner bar. Inside there were 24 drinkers, mostly students, 2 musicians, and 2 bartenders whom Simon recognized as ex-students. The musicians were setting up a microphone and amplifier. One of them, needless to say, surprised, pointed at him and waved. He had been in a lit survey course several years ago. Simon held up a hand and smiled, then took a seat at the corner of the bar and ordered a lager. He drank from thirst, emptying half the glass. This was a pleasant indulgence, he thought, and then it dimmed his realization that he had been treating himself to indulgences all day. Treating himself to suggests a temporary break from routine. Allowing himself suggests a well-established discipline purposely lapsed. Giving into suggests temptation's triumph over a faulty will. None of those verbs helped explain what he wanted this day to mean. He wanted the past to be only a building block, a scribbled ghost of an idea. He wanted this day to be the beginning of his second draft. Before he was finished with his beer, another appeared. The bartender answered Simon's quizzical expression with a tilt of his head indicating the guitar-playing former student, who waved again and smiled. Simon had not planned on staying. A second beer, a kindness for certain, would obligate him. He would be obliged to drink it and listen to the music. He could not choose a verb if no one would speak to him. Here, in this Friday night world of the campus bar, everything was carried out in sign language, and he was in danger of spending his time as other people wanted him to. Simon downed his first beer, took a sip of the second, and told the bartender he was grateful, but he had to go, and left the bar, giving a thumbs up at the door to the musicians. He wandered, though he wasn't really wandering, as he knew where he was and where each choice would take him. He realized, while grazing his hand through a bush that hung limply over a wooden fence, that he was experiencing a loneliness that endorsed him, a poet's eternal solitude in a day in which he'd made time to squander time. A wonderful day. He had loved it, and it would require his determination to continue, to make sure the next day and the next and the next would strongly resemble his first. The days might not be all as successful. It's a long life. But something morose grew in him. At first it seemed it was doubt about his will to proceed, but he knew enough about verbs and the people who use them to be ready for the long haul. No, he looked skyward. Stars twinkled, the moon shone, and there was a quiet space for a change where, in the dark charm of a fall evening, it dawned on him. The phone call, he said. His neck arched toward the solar system. When his head returned to a level position, he chose the surest verb of all. I love you, Carol. It was almost 9 o'clock when he arrived home. There were no lights on inside. Perhaps she had beeped in, got his message, and stayed out, had dinner with her colleagues. Or she came home, got his message, and fumed, then went to meet Tracy and Sin, the single ones, who spent Friday nights at the wine bar. Or she never heard his message but left him one that she was away overnight at her sister's. The dog did not come to the door. She could have taken him with her. There was no message on the machine from her, which suggested that she had received his. He toured the kitchen and found no signs of a meal either eaten or prepared. The living room gave no indication that any time had been spent there. No newspaper out of order, no empty potato chip bag, no crumbs, no shoes kicked off from the horizontal position and allowed to bounce wherever they would, Nothing like that. Simon had the feeling he had taken a risk, the same as he had felt when he had once gone with friends on a sailboat round Cutter's Point, or when he had gone into the woods near his home when he was 10 and walked too far, knowing he wasn't lost, but that he had broken an invisible plane and he was, in a new way, alone. He had sallied forth. Today, he must keep doing that. He wanted the risk-taker and the boy of 10 to stay. Chiku trotted into view from the bedroom, blinking. "Well, hello, young man," Simon said. He gave the dog a scratch and went to the bedroom. If that's where the dog had been, that's where Carol would be, and why he was so quiet. Simon walked softly to the side of the bed. She was in under the covers. She slept face up, with her legs crossed at the ankles. The outline that her hips made under the quilt brought unexpected arousal. He thought of the last time he had been affected this way while she was asleep, and how he had kissed her on the forehead and gone back into the living room to watch television. This time he took off his jacket, his shoes, his sweater vest and tie, and climbed in with her. She did not stir. Simon watched the bones above her cheeks and strong line of her nose for some sign of acknowledgement, but none came. Then, without opening her eyes, she answered the question she imagined he was asking. "I was tired." "Yes," he said. "Did you enjoy yourself?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer, and for most of his life Simon had not shied away from the complicated, for the complicated was the more complete truth. But he lay there next to his wife, and thought for the very first time that the truth was never complete, even in its most complicated form, and he couldn't be responsible for all of it. Whomever we are speaking to have a hand in our truth, he thought. Choose your verbs wisely. So instead of telling her how eventful and triumphant and perambulating his day had been, he simply said, "I did," and hoped that he would continue tomorrow where he had left off today. Then out of his mouth came the thing he was thinking, had thought 100,000 times, but had never, ever asked. "Did you miss me?" Carol still had not moved, but she opened her eyes and looked at him. She had been crying, he thought, and suddenly seemed genuinely glad to have him there. "You have new glasses. I like them on you." She reached out, took his shoulders in her hands, and kissed him. A long and confident kiss, the kind he remembered from before, when they were new to each other. "Take your pants off, silly," she said, in a voice he remembered from just such a time. Now for the discussion questions. Number 1. The story is called A Change of Verbs, but what is Simon, the professor, really changing about himself and the way he speaks? Number 2. The story seems to show the miraculous change that takes place when Simon changes his responses. If that's all it took to have a better, happier life, why do you think he or others ever say anything else? 3. Do you think Simon's change will, long-term, be a good or bad thing for him? What are some of the good and bad things that may come out of it? 4. How much like the new Simon are you in the way you speak? Why aren't you more like him? 5. What if Simon didn't love his wife? What do you think his change in verbs would have demanded he say or do? And that was A Change of Verbs, written by Tom Teti. Next week, we'll be reading Cost of Human Life by Shannon Francis Smith. If you enjoyed this story, head over to our companion podcast, After Dinner Conversation Discussions, and listen to our discussions of this and other short stories from our magazine. We will include a link in the description. And of course, you can always continue the discussion on our webpage in the comment section or on our Facebook page. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.